Okay, hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to provide you with context in the war in Ukraine. It is Thursday, April 24th, and here are 5 big stories for today. So I left you with this yesterday. It was talking about Donald Trump coming out with his truth post saying Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky came out and said he won't Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. Okay, I'm not going to belabor that because I talked about this as Trump's unfair response. I think he was way over the top in that response. So we're not going to talk about this, but he was talking about this statements very harmful to the peace negotiations. But wait a minute. So the Russians are doing the same thing on the other side. So Russia's Shoigu claims that EU peacekeepers in Ukraine could trigger World War III. It's our historic territory. Here you are with the ISW saying Russian officials rejected aspects of Trump's reported peace plan. Russian officials continue to give no indication that the Kremlin is willing to make any concessions, including that Russia will never participate in negotiations that discuss the possible deployment of European troops to Ukraine. Such a deployment is unacceptable. Skip down a little bit. Peskov stated that Russia rejected the full ceasefire that Trump previously proposed because the ceasefire failed to meet all of Russia's demands, including that Ukraine cede all of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia Oblast, all of which Russia has declared annexed. Okay, so the Russians are doing the exact same thing, but Trump is only talking about what Zelensky's doing, not what Putin's saying. The Kremlin agrees with Trump, who said on social media that Ukraine lost the Crimean Peninsula. Yeah, of course they did. Of course they agree with that. Here is Maria Zakharova from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Zelensky has categorically refused to make any concessions, declaring he would not legally recognize Crimea as a part of Russia. But wait a minute. The Kremlin has categorically rejected the full ceasefire that Trump previously proposed because the ceasefire failed to meet Russia's demands. So you got to be fair with these kinds of things. It's not okay to be one-sided. She goes on and says, such a dippy approach by the Kyiv regime once again highlights its inability to negotiate and lack of responsibility. But the same thing, Russia is also, by definition, the way she frames this, a dippy approach by the Russian regime, which highlights its inability to negotiate and a lack of responsibility. If she's saying this about Ukraine, then the same is true about Russia if Russia's doing the same thing, which it is. Okay, Zelensky, this is Michael McFaul saying, Zelensky would be committing political suicide in taking such a decision. Ukraine's a democracy. Why is your administration so eager to give Putin this concession? Nothing in the actual world would change except a hit to America's reputation. I don't even think Putin cares that much other than to ignite its divisions with America and between our allies. What U.S. interest is advanced from this? And he's replying to David Sachs, who's saying that Crimea should be the easiest concession for Zelensky to make because it's been a part of Russia for the last decade. It's never been acknowledged that way, but yeah. Okay, so, but yeah, Zelensky is not a dictator. He's a president of a democracy, and this would be just detrimental to both him and the democracy. Okay, here is Trump talking about this on Fox News last night, just a little highlight of it.
Deal with Russia. We have to get a deal with Zelensky, and I hope that Zelensky,
So he thinks he has a deal with Russia, he said first, right? How? In what world? When did Russia ever come to the table? But then he's being hard on Zelensky. I wish Zelensky would just, step up and do something.
Might be easier to deal with Zelensky. So far, it's been harder, but that's okay. It's all right. But I think we have a deal with both.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what he's thinking when he's saying that because Putin has not come to the table at all. Okay. Here's the White House press. Oh, by the way, I talked about this the other day. This is the Fox News TV channel logo, and this is the Fox television station logo. So when I talked about this the other day, Fox TV stations are like the Farm League. They're separate. They're under the same ultimate authority, but they're different divisions or different entities under that. And so for whatever that's worth, because some people were pointing out that Fox News said Kyiv is part of Russia. Well, that's a dopey thing. It's probably an error. I don't think it's a conspiracy by Fox News, which is the Fox News channel. I think it was just somebody at one of the Fox affiliates got it wrong, and that was stupid. Okay, back to the regular discussion here.
As President Trump rightfully pointed out in that statement, it was President Obama who gave up Crimea, who allowed Russia to take it over in 2014. And so the president is not asking Ukraine to recognize Crimea. Nobody has asked them to do that. What he is asking is for people to come to the negotiating table recognizing that this has been a brutal war for far too long.
Well, he was going to say that. I mean, that was part of what we understand was in the proposal, which is why Zelensky preempted it. Okay. Europe rejects recognition of Crimea as Russian and has informed Trump as much, saying like, we're never going to recognize Crimea as Russia. Well, I don't know that that's going to make a difference one way or another, but at least they're holding fast on that. This is Congressman Don Bacon, who's a stalwart defender. There's a handful of Republicans, not many, but just a few that are, saying this regularly now. No reward for Russia for its barbaric invasion. Okay. Yeah. Now, then you get to what happened last night. So last night there was this brutal missile and drone attack, and Ukraine was hit by 70 some odd missiles on top of the 100 some odd drones. And I talked about that in my daily brief last night. Okay, Zelensky says the missile strike is Russia's way of pressuring the U.S. He noted that Moscow had hoped for a scandal during Ukraine's meeting with the American side in London. It didn't happen. It actually kind of devolved a bit. We are much stronger today than at the start of the war, he said, adding that the main focus in London was on how to stop the war. Okay. So I'm not going to belabor this again, but like this is what the meeting looked like. Isn't it interesting what the difference of what this meeting at this table looks like as opposed to the two sides on either side for larger scale meetings? So this tells you about how Keith Kellogg ranks in the structure compared to Rubio or Kellogg and then Rubio and then Witkoff somehow above him in some weird way. I don't quite understand. Now, Trump came out and said this. To his credit, he said this, but he's not doing anything really about it. I'm not happy. This was 3 hours ago. I'm not happy with the Russian strikes on Kyiv. Not necessary and very bad timing. Vladimir, stop. 5,000 soldiers a week are dying. Again, I don't know where he's getting the math of 5,000, but let's get the peace deal done. Okay, so it's good that he's saying Putin stop, but he's not doing anything to cause Putin to stop, and Putin won't stop until he does something to cause him to stop. Okay, this is in the ISW, the reported U.S. proposal suggests that the Trump administration is seeking to simultaneously achieve a full ceasefire in Ukraine, conclude a peace settlement to end the war, and develop U.S.-Russian economic relations. Sharp contrast to the timeline of events the administration has called for. Yeah, they're trying to do too much. And if you're trying, isn't it a Russian proverb? Maybe it's somewhere else as well. But if you chase two rabbits, you get none. Yeah, well, they're chasing multiple rabbits simultaneously, and nothing's happening. Okay, here's how the Russian papers are explaining what's going to happen. This is Steve Rosenberg from the BBC. He does a really good job. I highlight this frequently. The Russian papers are talking about look, the U.S. is going to pull out of these negotiations, and won't that be a great thing? Listen to this.
Papers, it's pretty clear how Moscow will react. The country that invaded its neighbour is going to blame Ukraine and Europe, and will encourage the White House to do the same. Izvestia's headline, Destructive Thinking. Ukraine and Europe are scuppering Trump's peace plan.
Wait, how are they doing that? Isn't it Putin that's not coming to Russia's not coming to the table because Trump hasn't agreed to all of Russia's demands of the 4 territories and none of the European peacekeepers in Ukraine and that sort of thing, right? But they're blaming the Europeans.
The Russian government paper, Rossiyskaya Gazeta, writes that on the eve of talks in London, Zelensky rejected key parts of Trump's peace plan, putting American negotiators in an embarrassing situation.
Well, kind of, but that's not the whole story. The rest of the story is that Russia never agreed to even that much.
The paper calls this a pre-planned provocation by European leaders. It's
Yeah, so this is what they're going to keep doing, just a little bit more.
practically a foregone conclusion that the US will pull out of talks on Ukraine. Moscow is blaming Ukraine because it will want America to do the same and to end all US assistance to Kyiv. And Moscow
trying to drive a wedge between the Europeans and the Americans. And so far, they're being fairly successful. Okay. If Rubio, Trump, Kellogg, Vance abandon Ukraine and unleash Russia, they will go down in history as the greatest appeasers of evil in a civilized world has ever known. The rest of Europe must be prepared to step up massively for Ukraine's freedom. I think they're onto something. I think, we talk about peace in our time and what that was like and how despicable that was. It'll be overshadowed by a long shot. I showed this yesterday, but it's still a great visual. The question was, Russia's already 28 times larger than Ukraine, and yet it demands land in exchange for peace. And here's the question. How does that make any sense? How much more does Russia actually need? I like this image of a shark trying to, right? How much more land does Russia need? Just a little bit more? A little bit more? 29 times? 30? Okay. Crimea is Ukraine. You need to say it. Donetsk is Ukraine. Kharkiv is Ukraine. Kherson is Ukraine. Luhansk is Ukraine. But now, because Russia's talking about their stuff, you also need to say Mykolaiv is Ukraine and Zaporizhzhia is Ukraine. You're going to need to start naming even more oblasts because the Russians are going to keep coming. Okay, this is the fourth big story. Politico put this out. White House debates lifting sanctions on Russian energy assets, Nord Stream. Okay, now, this turns out it doesn't look like it's actually true, at least not according to Rubio, who came out and said this is unequivocally false. Neither Steve Witkoff nor I had any conversations about lifting sanctions against Russia as part of a deal with Ukraine. Okay, so Rubio is responding to this Politico report and says there's no plans, but it's good that you get him on record saying that because some things could happen. So it's actually good in that regard, even if the story is not true, that there is some plan. There has been some rumors about that. General sentiment among Ukrainian public toward Trump's peace efforts is that Ukraine doesn't need the U.S. to capitulate. If Ukraine wanted to capitulate, they don't need the U.S.'s help. That's what it's saying. And it could have done so any time over the past 3 years if it wanted to. But that's not what it needs. All right, last big story. Pope Francis just recently passed, just a couple of days ago. Pope Francis showed empathy for Ukraine's suffering, but couldn't break Vatican Cold War diplomatic traditions. And here's the actual article in Euromaidan Press. From his early reluctance to name Russia as the aggressor to suggesting in 2022 that NATO's barking at Russia's door, that was some problematic language, right? This is where he got it wrong. But at the same time, the pontiff was marked by humanitarian efforts, including Vatican-involved prisoner exchanges. He mediated some of that. Okay, the contradictory approach reflected Francis's attempt to balance Vatican diplomatic tradition, which goes back to the Cold War, with his genuine empathy for Ukrainian suffering. And I think that's fair. But his ambivalent standpoint reflects Vatican diplomatic tradition, which condemns violence and human rights violations, but hesitates to name perpetrators. And this goes back into Vatican history, where maybe they were on the wrong side of some things, and they're trying to not do that because they're trying to be the church rather than to be a power within Europe. This tradition is, in my view, ambiguous and doesn't align with the church's prophetic calling, which is to call evil evil. And that's correct. But I also want to point this out. The Pope who secretly funded Ukrainian drones, what? Do you know about that? His legacy is genuine empathy for Ukraine, undermined by diplomatic ambiguity that failed to name evil. So he failed in one regard, but in another regard, he was paying with his personal money to purchase Ukrainian drones. So there is something to say there. Okay, last little bit. I'll show you this meme. 1980s GOP. The Soviets won't expand, right? I mean, it was actually Reagan who turned the Russia's expanding back for the first time, with Soviet expanding for the first time on the little island of Grenada. And here's the modern GOP. Zelensky should just give Russia half of Ukraine. Yeah. I don't know what's gone wrong. This is just the wrong approach, and we need to be more like the Reagan-esque kind of conservative GOP than the modern Trumpian GOP that is just like not with it. The populists don't seem to register that this has to be stood up to, and it's not. You can't just say this isn't our problem, because it will become your problem if you take that approach. All right, my friends, that's all that I have. Thank you for your time, the likes, the shares, the subscribes, the coffees. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.